Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. I'm Harrison Pitt. I'm a fellow at the New Culture Forum, and I'm thrilled to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, one of the leading contributors at Courage Media, and our special guest this week, Paul Coleman, the lawyer and executive director of the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is an organisation committed to the defence of free speech and human dignity. Paul, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So the US Vice President J.D. Vance recently censured European elites at the Munich Security Conference for talking a good game about concepts like freedom and democracy while simultaneously muzzling their own citizens at times and punishing, even going so far as to punish thought crime. Did you agree with the bulk of the Vice President's remarks?
I thought it was a fantastic speech. I think it was actually one of the best political speeches that I can remember in my adult lifetime, because I think that Vice President Vance just really put his finger on a lot of the challenges that we're facing in Europe. I watched the speech and thought it was as if a prophet was coming from a foreign land to sort of tell us what we all already know but needed telling. And so I was very encouraged by the speech, particularly because of Vance's emphasis and focus on something that I consider to be extremely important, which is freedom of speech.
And in particular, you probably too humble to mention it, but he even mentioned one of your clients, didn't he? Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
He did. So about 10% of his speech was dedicated to one of our cases, which we didn't expect. But it was the case of Adam Smith Connor. So this is an Army veteran and someone who has made it his practice for a number of years to pray silently in the vicinity of an abortion facility near his home. Now, the reason he does this is because a number of years ago, he participated in help fund the abortion of his son with his then girlfriend. He then converted to Christianity. It was a decision he deeply regrets. And so he makes it his practice to pray for his unborn son and also others affected by abortion. He's not intrusive. He doesn't block anyone's access. He doesn't engage with anyone. It's just a small act that he participates in for that. He was arrested by the police. He was prosecuted and he was convicted essentially for the crime of silent prayer. Which was shocking to all of us here in the UK, but shocking to everyone else around the world. And this was the case that Vice President Vance picked up on and highlighted as really, I think, Exhibit A in the censorship that we're seeing across Western Europe.
Hello. Please excuse this brief interruption, but I'd be really grateful if you could please hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. Our mission is vitally important, and we must grow this channel to ensure that our content reaches the biggest possible audience. The best way to do this is for you to subscribe. It's totally free. And in addition to subscribing, if you're able to donate or join our membership scheme, please click on the link in the description or visit our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. We've got great plans ahead, but we can't do it without your support. From only £4 per month, you'll receive a range of perks and benefits, including exclusive content. Thank you.
It was pretty astonishing as well because I don't know whether Connor saw it, but Stella Creasy started trying to, the Labour MP started talking about how Vance wanted to bring back, what's that wretched novel?
It's literally The Handmaid's Tale.
It's literally The Handmaid's Tale.
Which is based on Afghanistan and Iran, by the way. Yeah. But then conveniently in 2016 was retroactively fitted for the Trump administration because somehow Trump is the archetypal Christian patriarch.
In other words, so I mean, let's give her case a hearing. What do you think when people like Stella Creasy say that this constitutes a form of harassment? I mean, my instincts would be, well, we already have harassment laws. If people really are harassing people, just invoke those, surely. But what's your view on that?
That's exactly right. So we already have a criminal offence of harassment in the UK. We've had it for a number of years, long before all of these new laws came into force. What we see in the UK across Europe is a very similar pattern, basically, which is those like Stella Creasy, they say something that we need this law, we need new legislation, we need powers to address these certain behaviours. Most of the time, there are already laws in existence that could achieve those ends. and then they draft very vaguely worded legislation which goes far beyond the initial thing that they said it was for.
Exactly, yeah.
And we see then these creeping powers of the state and of the police in enforcing these new laws. We see this in a whole range of different areas. And so in the UK in the last decade, we have seen these buffer zones, as they call, censorship zones, around different abortion facilities in the UK, always with the idea that it's to stop harassment, while at the same time having laws already stopping harassment on the books.
Do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that Stella Creasy is the archetypal devouring mother because she made a big deal out of demanding a creche in Parliament because she brought her child into the Commons.
Oh, yes.
And then when that battle was lost, she then set about demanding the right to an abortion at any point up until birth, I suppose until the baby's crowning. She demands to be able to crack its skull open into a British Bill of Rights. Wants to just sever all dependent care obligations for mothers. She's the kind of person that was haunt Mary Harrington's nightmares, I suppose. But I think it is important. We have a Labour government at the moment. They are instantiating this intolerance of the Christian conscience, demanding that people who pray for the souls of unborn babies be silenced to placate the consciences of murderers. This was, however, passed under a Conservative government, was it not? And it has also been put in place in Scotland under the SNP. What's the history of this legislation? Like, how stringent is it? Are there any differences between Scotland and the UK? Because I've heard that Scotland's much stricter recently.
Yeah, so it's a good point. At the moment in the media, we're seeing a lot of criticism towards the Starmer government, Starmer crackdown on free speech and so forth. The Starmer government hasn't enacted any new legislation censoring speech. What is happening right now is the enforcement of laws that the previous Conservative government oversaw the introduction of. And then before that, the Blair-Brown Labour government from 97 onwards. And so I think we've had about a quarter of a century of successive governments, whether Labour or Conservative, introducing at every parliamentary session new laws that censor speech. And for the Conservative part, they introduced laws in 2014 that allowed for what's called public space protection orders. And so the legislation itself doesn't create buffer zones, but it gives power to local councils to do that if they want to.
Were Bournemouth the first one to do that?
Yeah, so you have Bournemouth, Birmingham, and about a half dozen around the UK that have gone down this route. And there's huge flexibility in how these are drafted. And so a lot of the drafting of these public space protection orders honestly insanely worded. You can't believe that we're living in a country where laws are in existence that ban the sort of stuff that these do. And so that was the Conservative Party 2014. And then fast forwards 8 years, and then they introduced national buffer zone legislation in 2022, again, with a Conservative majority in the House of Commons. And then Northern Ireland and Scotland did the same. The laws are all essentially the same. And in a nutshell, as well as banning the things we've already talked about that are already banned, like harassment, these laws go further and they ban influencing, this word influencing. And so what influencing means is a matter of interpretation. And so could influencing mean prayer? Could influencing mean silent prayer, as in Adam's case? Could influencing mean, as in the case we have coming up next month, holding a sign saying, here to talk if you want? So literally just holding a sign, offering a consensual conversation. If that's considered influencing someone's decision, ultimately it could be considered a criminal offence. And the main difference with Scotland is that it extends further beyond the abortion facility. So it goes 200 metres out. In the UK, it's 150. And then in Scotland, it also covers people's private residences. And so in the news this week, there's a story about government, a member of parliament in Scotland saying essentially, if you are caught praying in your own home, that could be a criminal offence, quote, depending on who's passing by. And so it's like it saw the English legislation and then decided to go further in a number of different ways.
It was much like Humza Yousaf's attempt to abolish the dwelling defence with the hate crime legislation. The other issue is, again, under a Conservative government, and I like Suella Braverman very much, but she didn't tackle this properly, is when she tried to reconfigure non-crime hate incidents to ensure they weren't being recorded mendaciously, to get around the original Public Order Act of 1986, which said that, you can't be convicted of public order offence if you're not in public, if you're in your own home. They said for offences that would upset people, would cause gross offence that aren't in public, and we can't prosecute them as a public order offence, we record a non-crime hate incident instead. And that was, again, passed under a Conservative government.
So numbers of recordings actually went up in the aftermath of that alteration, didn't they?
Exactly, yeah, year on year. Very frustrating.
Yeah, so I think one of the headlines of the time that we're living in, I think that's important for everyone to realise, is that the attack on free speech in the UK is not just a left-wing or a right-wing or a Labour or a Conservative Party issue. We have had successive governments in our entire adult lifetimes passing censorial legislation. I think in many ways it started with Blair. There's a couple of pieces from the 1980s, but the real wave of censorial legislation started with Tony Blair. Raft of terrorism legislation, then came things like the Communications Act, the Racial and Religious Hatred Act, incitement to hatred, and then coming in 2010, Conservatives saw all of that and then just continued the trend. So they're the ones who brought in buffer zones. They're the ones who brought in non-crime hate incidents. They're the ones who brought in public space protection orders. And they're the ones who expanded existing legislation in policing and sentencing and so forth, criminal justice acts, to extend police powers and clamp down on speech and help build, in a sense, the surveillance state that we now have. And so I think that one of the popular talking points that I often see in the media is the idea that, it's Starmer's fault, it's Labour's fault. They might be marginally worse, but the fact is, the sad reality is that we have voted in successive governments for over a quarter of a century who have restricted our speech.
There's loads of directions in which I can take that, so hopefully we can get to all of them. But I suppose it would be good to start with, so people on our rough side of the debate have for many years been outgunned, not just by all of the laws that you're talking about, but institutionally as well. For every ADF lawyer, there must be 1,000 human rights lawyers in this country. And there are these vast patronage networks across the West. Many of them, it emerges, were actually being funded by the US State Department, USAID. But the State Department is in different hands these days, and it was very interesting recently to see that one of their affiliated Twitter accounts, of course now run by Trump, was drawing attention, I think, precisely to the case you just mentioned about that person who was outside an abortion clinic inside one of these restricted buffer zones, offering, as you say, a consensual conversation, shining a spotlight on this sort of thing. Obviously, that is a good start in many ways. But given the overwhelming disparity in terms of how outgunned we are institutionally, how do you think we can close that gap? And might we even go so far as to say that we want a USID that is as deep-pocketed as the one that went prior, but is on our side?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, so on the US side of things, I think it's monumental what has happened this year with the changing of the guard in the US. Not just because it was another election. Everyone says every election is the most important in our lifetimes and so forth. We're used to that. But I think that up until that moment, this sort of what's referred to as the censorship industrial complex, it had really taken root with great uniformity across the US, across the Anglosphere around the world, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, and then across the European Union. And essentially everyone was united in that effort and has been for the last decade. And so what we're seeing now, even in just the last couple of months, is a seismic shift take place the other side of the Atlantic, with not only the US saying they're not going to do that anymore, but really reversing course. And I think that it's too early to say how that's going to play out. But if it continues to go on the trajectory that it's going on, we could see that seismic shift that's taken place in the US have significant ramifications over here. We already heard that Vice President Vance is talking about free speech, not only as an ideal, as a virtue and so forth, but also as a basis for policy when dealing with Europe, including on matters of security, matters of trade and so forth. And so I think that there's a great opportunity now with what's happened there to carry some of that momentum over and see if some of that can start to be implemented here, and we can have our own version of what's happening. There's a long way to go before that happens, but I'm certainly more encouraged sitting here today than I would have been 3 or 4 months ago.
I see. And do you think, even if obviously all of the laws that you lament aren't going to be repealed overnight, well, probably they're not going to be, just because JD Vance has a meeting with David Lammy or whatever it
Poor
might
JD Vance.
Poor JD Vance or whatever it might be. But do you think that it's possible? Or no, that's too sort of too offence-sitting a word. Do you think it's likely that JD Vance's advocacy on behalf of free speech, his censuring of European elites, will have a moderating effect on the censorious instincts of people like Keir Starmer?
I think it could, particularly in the area of the digital space, because when we're talking about speech in the digital age, we're largely talking about US platforms. So we're largely talking about US companies where the US has a particular interest. And so I think whether these offline sort of free speech restrictions will be affected or not, we're not sure. But the US has made it very clear that they're not going to stand for US companies having their own rights and freedoms restricted in the UK and in Europe. And so Twitter, the metaverse, and so forth, I think now has a new ally in the State Department. And I think that could have an effect. And we read the news recently that with the UK's Online Safety Act coming into force, which will massively regulate the digital sphere, that there's already talk of will that be positively impacted for free speech because of these remarks by Vance and others. And so in the digital space, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there because of the fact that so many of these digital companies are US companies.
Well, the mood at the State Department is very different. I spoke to a friend who was moving into that domain, and he said the vibe shift has meant so that the likes of Marco Rubio sees the censorship going on in the UK of clients like Isabel Vaughan-Spruce equivalent to the persecution of Christians in China or in Iran. So they would regard them on the same platform. Were they to have some kind of summit there, they would be just as open to having UK distance as they would, persecuted Iraqi Christians, for example. So that's one very prominent thing. And the other very prominent thing is not to underestimate the realignment of Silicon Valley's tech bros and entrepreneurs with the Trump camp. Zuckerberg showed up at CPAC the other week, which is very shocking. He's obviously, moving with the political currents to ensure that he's still favored by the regime and isn't overly regulated, but it shows that momentum is in that direction. And then Musk himself, of course, attached himself to the Trump campaign, ran the America PAC, is involved with the Department of Government Efficiency. And even though we as three Christians might be sitting around the table going, well, we have some quibbles with Musk's sexual ethics and personal life, it is an unalloyed good that he took over Twitter from the censors before. If I'm right in thinking, were ADF involved in a case with X in Brazil and Michael Schellenberger? So that means that you're on the right side of that. Do you mind just elaborating on some of those details?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's part of this censorship industrial complex. So maybe I could just take a step back and unpack that. So what Schellenberger helped document with the exposing of the Twitter files when Musk bought X and then released all of this to three journalists, to Michael Schellenberger, to Barry Weiss, and to Matt Taibbi. And then they essentially, over a period of weeks and months, broke the news of how X was in cahoots with the US government to censor speech. And so what that revealed is a massive web, this industrial complex, where essentially the US government outsources censorship, which it's not allowed to do itself under the First Amendment, through funding various different foundations. And then ultimately that money goes to the fact checkers, the censors, and the platforms to censor speech. And so there's this whole web of interplay between public and private leading to mass digital censorship, not just in the US, but using it through USAID and others, spreading this around the world. And so, including in Brazil. And so, in Brazil, there was a big battle going on between those in power, particularly one Supreme Court Justice, Moraes, and X, where he was essentially trying to have X remove certain accounts that this one justice did not like, remove this account, and so forth. X refused to comply with that, and then the entire platform was shut down in the country. And so we got involved in that case. We actually represent a number of members of the Brazilian Congress now in a case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where we are defending their free speech rights before this international tribunal. And we'll see where that case goes. But as a result of all of that, we were involved with X, with Michael Schellenberger, a number of other different free speech advocates to essentially make the point that what was happening in Brazil is a test case for what could well happen in the UK, across the European and elsewhere. And the test case is essentially the government wants to force private companies to censor speech. And that's what was happening secretly behind the scenes. Where those companies refuse to do so, the governments then say, well, we will shut you down. You will not be able to operate in this jurisdiction if you don't do this. It's like the ultimate end game of the censorship. And that's what we saw in Brazil. And then as soon as that happened, we saw political figures in Europe and elsewhere saying, we will do the same thing here as well. So I think the Brazil situation was essentially a trial run for what we could see play out, which is why it was so important to engage on that issue and say, if you're in power, you can't just shut down a platform because you don't like what people are saying on it.
It was that's quite similar in form to what, I'm not sure at what stage, maybe this is worth talking about, at what stage the Online Safety Act is at the moment. I haven't looked into it for a while, but last time I did look into it, the really sort of sinister and insidious thing about that act, which again was, I think, initially drafted by Conservatives and championed by people like Boris Johnson and Nadine Dorries in particular, who was very obsessive in defending it peculiarly.
Caroline Dinich was the main spearhead on
yes,
that, who
that's
said
right.
that Bev Turner should be thrown off air on GB News for saying that Russell Brand should see a day in court before said allegations were believed. Yeah. So, overstepping her bounds on free speech.
To say the least,
Yeah, quite.
It was pretty extraordinary. And so, but one of the things about that act that was particularly sinister is that there was no clause in it which explicitly said, you must take down this, you must take down that. It was more that it was going to be holding social media companies to their own self-proclaimed standards and empowering the regulator to interpret that and to levy incredibly serious fines that would basically just pressure these companies into thinking, we don't want that day in court, we don't like the arbitrariness of this, so we're just going to err on the side of censorship all of the time. Sounds very similar to the cases case you just described in Brazil.
Exactly. In fact, I would say that the censorship industrial complex is a global playbook, basically. Mm-hmm. And so you see this legislation cropping up almost identical in all the jurisdictions I mentioned, the Anglosphere, the European Union, other Western nations. And so you have these online safety bills. They create things like, for example, in Australia, the e-safety commissioner. You have here in the UK, it's going to be regulated by Ofcom. In European Union, under the Digital Services Act, the DSA, they have their own regulatory bodies at the national level, which the thing sets up. And they, again, it's like this outsourcing of censorship. So their hands are clean. You even heard someone like Thierry Breton recently say the Digital Services Act does not regulate speech. It mentions illegal content 100 times, which is a lot of times for something that doesn't regulate speech. Yeah. It mentions misinformation, hate speech, and so forth. The reason he can do this wordplay and the reason they can here with the Online Safety Act and others is because there's a sort of technical truth to it in the sense that the act itself is not, but it's laying the infrastructure from which all of this censorship will come at the regulatory level through all of these different webs of regulators, fact checkers, and so forth. And so, in a nutshell, this sort of legislation says if you don't censor speech, we will fine you crippling fines that will destroy your company. But there is no penalty for over-censorship. Yeah. And so if you say, if you don't take this down, we will fine you tens of millions of pounds. If you take down too much, no problem. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think is going to happen over time? Massive incentive to censor. And the forerunner to all of this was the Network Enforcement Act in Germany. So that was the first piece of legislation that went down this route, and then everything else is sort of copycat. I see. And so in Germany, that's exactly what's happened. There's plenty of studies now that show that Germany is zealously censoring lawful speech, erring on the side of censorship over freedom, because there's no prize for protecting free speech, and there's a heavy penalty for failing to censor.
And it's sometimes pretty damn brazen, as far as I can tell, in Germany. I think this is a CBS crew. They were reporting on this event as if it was the most unobjectionable thing in the world because they're a mainstream news organization, but to my mind, it looked pretty horrifying. Basically, these German police officers breaking into, well, not breaking into, but like, what's the word, banging down someone's door and arresting him for memes he was in possession of. It can get very, very staggering.
Those three Muppets characters sat around the table as well, saying, yes, of course, we will prosecute you if you have offended somebody.
Exactly.
How dare you mock my awful haircut? It's just, you know, and one particularly prominent example of the censorship industrial complex going transatlantic that Musk was annoyed about is the fact that Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's new chief of staff after Sue Gray went on a very long holiday and then found herself in the House of Lords. How conspicuous. He ran the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. He founded it. The Centre for Countering Digital Hate had a meeting during the summer protests and riots following Southport, telling counter-terror police, the Home Office, the Met, etc., that Ofcom needed more emergency powers under the Online Safety Act to police misinformation. So they get their foot in the door and they always escalate the powers. And then it turns out, I think it was Matt Taibbi that published this originally, that they were corresponding with Senator Amy Klobuchar's team, who just so happens to run the inauguration as well, because the Democrats thought they'd stick that thumb in the eye of the Trump administration, to, quote, kill Musk's Twitter during the election. Now, again, that's election interference. The House Judiciary Committee have got that on their plate, but it just shows you this sort of public-private partnership. It's constantly working hand in glove to censor lawful speech. No wonder J.D. Vance pointed out, and no wonder that the German politicians in particular, you mentioned, decided to weep, wail and gnash their teeth at the very suggestion, while then also saying, we have to censor people to save democracy.
Absolutely. And I think that everyone assumed that Kamala Harris would win. I mean, up until the very recent last 6 months, it was assumed that there'd be another Democrat term. And I think that had that happened, all of this infrastructure would have been almost impossible to unpick at that point, which is why what's happened in the last couple of months is so important, not just for the US, but globally, because this insidious sort of public-private complex that has been built up, it would have become so entrenched, it would be almost impossible, I think, to unpick. Now, let's see, it's game on, I think, a little bit to whether that will be possible or not. I think it would have been impossible had things continued along this trajectory because it's been very carefully laid in place since 2015-16. That was when in the US you had the election of Trump. Here in Europe we had Brexit. Both of these events shocked the political elites, shocked the media elites. No one saw either of those events coming. And of course, the conclusion from both of them was not, well, let's take a moment of self-reflection and think why people voted this way. The conclusion of both events was the people have been tricked by misinformation, and so we need to stop this happening. So we need to censor speech to save democracy. That was essentially the storyline for the last decade. And then at the same time as they decided to do that, the advent of digital technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, meant that they could censor at a mass level in a way that was never possible before. So up until in 2025, so they've had almost exactly a decade of laying this infrastructure. There's very much, and then of course COVID accelerated the whole thing. And so I think that the seismic shift in the US is now a question, can this infrastructure be unpicked and undone? Or will we end up in a situation where it is for the US, but the rest of us live under the tyranny that was created by previous regimes?
It's a bit slightly in the rearview mirror now, so it might be possible to look at it with more clarity. The whole sort of post Southport summer, and I don't mean people who are engaging in violence or property damage, but people who were maybe posting ill-advised memes online, aggressive rage rhetoric on Facebook, all these sorts of things. Many of those people have landed themselves in prison. I think one chap was even just at a demonstration and said, "Who the F is Allah?" in the vicinity of a policeman. I think he got about 2 years. I could be getting some of the details on this wrong, but everyone knows what happened, and not all of the people who were banged up for that were banged up for crimes for acts that they committed, more things that they said. That is probably. It was in the aftermath of that. We've now got Angela Rayner, who's going to be heading an Islamophobia law task force. Do you think that, firstly, what did you think of that post-Southport summer on the points that I was just mentioning? And second to that, do you think that in some way that has provided the Labour government with a pretext to erode the legal foundations of what's free speech we do still have in the UK even more?
So I think that the post-Southport actions of the Starmer government were terrifying. I think that the way in which they went about censoring speech was probably the most brazen that I can think of. I think ever. I think certainly in my lifetime. because they were the way they were filming arrests and posting them on social media, the way they were just talking tough about their standing army of censors, and making all these insane threats about if you dare speak out, then we'll be coming knocking at your door. I think I saw one video that the police filmed of someone stepping off his plane coming back from holiday with the police there waiting for him and so forth. So it was this really choreographed effort to spread fear amongst the country. They
also called them criminals before they were even charged.
Right.
Which technically was spreading misinformation under the Online Safety Act, but of course, freedom for me and the law for my enemies, etc., etc.
Exactly. And doxing them as well, and on all of this. And what the situation, we're bearing in mind, all of that happened under a legal context that Starmer did not create. And so I think that what it reveals is just this web of censorial legislation that already exists that most people don't really think about, because we're living in the classic sort of slowly boiled frog situation. We have become so accustomed to the fact that every legislative session a new bill is passed that censors speech, that it just becomes part of the normal sort of living in Britain. And then a situation like Southport reveals that in an instant, all of this apparatus can kick into gear, and you have all of these different things already talked about: public order offences, communication act offences, racial and religious hatred, even terrorism. And it's all there and ready to go. And that's what Southport revealed, that they can basically press a button and the country is on speech lockdown.
Yes, and all of a sudden the people who are suspicious of these laws and want them repealed and want to fall back on some of our common law freedoms, for instance, around free speech, like the common law breach of the peace principle, all of a sudden those people begin to look like the eccentrics, particularly if you've given these bills very Orwellian titles like the Online Safety Act or the Race Relations Act or the Protecting Fluffy Kittens Act. All of a sudden the person who wants to take that stuff away, because most people don't actually read the small print, looked like headbangers and eccentrics.
Exactly, and probably the terrorism legislation is the most obvious example, because everyone's like, I'm not a terrorist. Of course, I agree with legislation.
I don't like terrorism.
Yeah, I personally do not like terrorism. And so, but then you see the bait and switch, because 25 years goes by. It was 2000 Terrorism Act comes in under Blair, and then 25 years goes by, and then Starmer is then using that same legislation to say, but the new threat is lonely young men in their bedrooms.
Yes.
And we I think we're going to have to amend the terrorism legislation to deal with this new threat.
Yeah. I have two more questions. Maybe Connor has some as well. But the first one I want to ask is, so obviously the raison d'etre of the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, which you're the executive director of, is that you are you have legal manpower, and your advocacy is primarily takes that legal form. But I suppose my question to you, what are organisations like the ADF supposed to do when all of the legal foundations of our freedoms are eroded altogether? Because then you have nothing to reach for on the statute books that you can even invoke again in defence of people's freedom. It's obviously a difficult question.
Yes, difficult question. Terrifying thought. Obviously makes our life much more difficult.
Yeah.
So we work as an organisation, I would say, on 4 levels. So in courtrooms through litigation to defend fundamental freedoms, in parliaments in terms of legislative advocacy, international institutions like the EU and the United Nations, which has a huge impact on all of us, whether we realise it or not, and then in the public square. And so we require a baseline of the rule of law and a baseline at a legislative level and a judicial level in order to be able to operate. And one of my sort of existential fears is not only what does it look like for ADF in post that world, but what does it look like for any of us?
Of course,
where we cannot expect rule of law, we cannot expect a fair hearing. What I would say to that is, we work in countries around the world, including countries that objectively have a lower standard of rule of law and so forth than we do here in the UK. And we're still able to make inroads and be effective in those contexts. So I think, look, if everything falls through and we're living in sort of apocalyptic times, then that's another question. Yeah. But even at the sort of levels that we're seeing in other parts of the world, it's still possible as a legal organization to be effective. So thankfully, I don't think that we are there yet in a sort of apocalyptic, there is no rule of law world. I think that we've seen an extraordinary attack on these things in our adult lifetimes. I think it will take a huge effort to turn that around, which is what we exist to do. But I don't think the floor has fallen through completely yet either.
I see. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. We were at ARC, and there seems to be a vision of the future being put forward by opponents to incursions on free speech that have been caused by multiculturalism and ethno and religious fracturing, sort of a breaking apart of the social fabric that has been instigated by those governments that you've spoken about, and then those governments have rushed to fill the gap of cultural cohesion with more censorious speech legislation to make all these groups play nice. And one of the offers has been to take on the aspect of Catherine Birbalsing's Michaela School, which responded to Islamic activism by a student and their parents in the courts with banning prayer of all kinds. Now, as I understand it, ADF sources their defense of free speech not just from legal technicalities, but because they believe that free speech is the best way to speak truth, and truth matters because there is an objective truth, and because we all have inalienable rights imparted onto us by God, etc. So what do you make of the turn by some defenders of free speech that say that we just need a purely neutral, liberal, legalistic public square that then would equally marginalise the Christian conscience to try and prevent more censoriousness by Islamic activists, for example?
Yeah, so I think it would be a mistake to address the challenges that we're facing as a country to sort of create this lowest common denominator baseline of restriction that in your words, makes everyone play nice. You know, I think that I refuse to accept that the solution to the problems that we face is essentially an increased police state that sort of regulates our behavior at such a level that, we don't see these challenges anymore because we are the students of Michaela School walking silently down the corridor, and I think that now, that isn't to say that the answers here are easy, but it is to say I don't think we want like a silent, neutralized public square where we walk down the high street with our facial recognition, Chinese-made surveillance, security cameras keeping everyone in line, because there's no other way of dealing with all of the tensions and challenges that we have now brought upon ourselves. So I think that somehow we have to figure out how we can have a maximalist view of freedom of speech and then deal with whatever bubbles out of that at a societal level with all of the things that we're talking about.
Could not possibly agree more. And I do have one question which is highly practical, so hopefully won't take up too much of your time or ours. What advice would you give to people practically, either in as private citizens, but I'm thinking particularly public officials who feel up against it, say in the civil service, and they don't want to become public whistleblowers because then they have to leave the civil service, and then the civil service is even more stacked against us than it already is. What advice would you give to those people who feel as though their free speech rights within their institutions are being violated?
I think the only way that we're going to turn this around, if it's possible at all at this stage, is through courage, and the courage to speak out. And I think that if we all self-censor ourselves for fear of the personal repercussions that will bring, then we've lost. And I know that's easy for me to say because I work for an organization probably not going to incur penalties for defending freedom of speech and so forth. But I do think it is essential. And one of the cases that we have in Finland is a member of parliament, former government minister, who has now faced 5 years of criminal prosecution for speaking freely, for expressing her Christian beliefs about marriage and human sexuality on Twitter. And so,
what's her name?
Päivi Räsänen.
Yes.
And so, no, she's a mother of 5. She's a grandmother of, I think, 12 now. She gets a new grandchild every few months as this case goes on. I've walked with her in this case for the last 5.5 years and seen her extraordinary courage throughout. At any point, she could take these posts down, she could make a deal, it would all go away. It's taken a huge amount of energy and investment from her and her family, but she's holding the line on freedom of speech because she knows how important it is. And I think that same level of courage needs to be replicated by everyone else in public life and also private citizens as well, because I think it's the only way out of this. Secondly, we have to recognize that we're all to an extent complicit because we are all citizens within this democracy that has elected successive governments that turns around and censors us, as we've talked about. And so I think that part of what we have to do is not only have the courage and the boldness to not self-censor, but to speak freely, but also to bring meaningful change legislatively and at a political level to undo what we have, in a sense, been part of voting for the last quarter century.
Paul Coleman, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been very, very instructive and enlightening. Thank you. Connor, thank you. As ever, you've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.